This week, I want to focus entirely on the game's UI and polishing it, because when I look back at the beginning of this week, I really realized that I'm glad I didn't release the demo because the way Primus looked simply wasn't up to standard. The UI really wasn't living up to what I wanted the game to be, and some of the panels still looked like placeholders rather than finished parts of the game. And this is something I've been thinking about a lot since the first release of my game, Scarred Steel. Obviously, that was my first game, so I expected it to be rough in places, but looking back at it now, I think some of the UI and visual designs was really quite sloppy. I don't necessarily say that just because I used AI. I think there were probably plenty of things that I could have improved on myself when it came to, things like the layout and just making the information easier to read. So the goal for this week was pretty simple. Go through the main screens and make them look more polished. I started with a faction selection scene, and I decided to take a screenshot of the panel I had, give it to ChatGPT, and basically ask it to make me an image of what it could look like even better. And that image was really quite useful. And from there, I was able to get a feel for what the game could have looked like or could look like, and then work from there. Sometimes I would then look at taking, certain parts from those images and just improving. I just felt like, the image that they gave me, the framing was better, the information had more structure, the buttons felt like they more belonged to the game, etc. For example, what I could also do as well is I could separate parts of the design that I could actually use. If the image gave me a frame or a box that I liked, I would ask ChatGPT to generate that element on its own, and then I could bring that into the game. I could resize it so that it could actually work with the game. And I did that for various other scenes, including, things like the save and load section in the main menu, things like the infirmary panel, the barracks panel, and much more. And I mean, the new versions at the moment aren't perfect because there's still a few smaller details I need to look at more closely. For example, like some of, the helmets or icons aren't necessarily shaped perfectly and are shaped a little bit strange. But I think that cleanup will probably be something I look to do more so in the future, as that's not a massive issue at the moment. But I think one of the more useful things that came out of this process was a new way of displaying stats. So one of the things that when ChatGPT went and displayed the barracks panel and gave me an image for that, it almost like made these segment bars made up of 5 squares. Each square could be filled in depending on how high a stat was. So instead of just seeing, I don't know, your attack being at 30, you could see, the segment bar being filled up 4 out of the 5 bars, meaning that from a immediate glance, you can see that that attack is high, for example. And that was something which I thought was pretty cool. So in the end, I ended up getting ChatGPT to make me one of the squares. I then copied that. I then removed the inside of that, and I was able to make the segment bar working, at least for the barracks panel. The goal will probably be to have that also working with the gladiator panel, but from a glance, when you're recruiting gladiators, you can at least see, the stats from a glance, so you can get an idea for who you want to pull into your gladiator roster. So that's pretty good. I also used the same idea for gladiator abilities, where abilities can now be upgraded from level 1 to level 4, and the segmented display makes it much clearer what level each ability is currently at. Now that wasn't actually something I planned to add at the start of the week, but it came to my to my thoughts, and I thought actually I think that would be a really cool thing to do overall. So by the end of the week, most of the panels had received some kind of visual overload. And honestly, I think, it feels more consistent. It actually feels more part of a gladiator game. And although there is still work to do, I think that actually the game is in a much clearer state. So this week has actually turned out pretty productive. I really can't complain. I think it's been a nice discovery being able to use ChatGPT not only to brainstorm, but to brainstorm visually in terms of how things could look in my game. And that alone, I think, has made some very big strides in terms of what I now realize that I can do with game UI as a whole. And this is sort of why, I am just going to be continuing to make games. I want to be able to, I guess, get 1% better when it comes to using AI to make games that just feel better. I know that the sort of thing I'm doing is very much an uphill battle, especially using lots of AI, but I do want to actually prove people wrong. I do want people to enjoy the games I make. So moving forward to the upcoming week. The plan really is going to be getting, like all the panels working. So I've had to obviously focus on filling lots of things in with various panels, things like the infirmary panel I need to work on as such. So that'll be something I do at the beginning of the week. But ideally, I want to be able to use this upcoming week to playtest and to balance things out and have things in a good enough state. And ideally, play the game from start to, I guess, the demo finish, which will be defeating the second gatekeeper boss. And that being that, and hopefully that then means I can release the demo by the end of next week. That is pretty much the goal, because I want to be able to have the demo be a good representation of the game, which is also why I obviously didn't end up releasing it sort of earlier this week when I had planned to. But yeah, I think really the main thing for me is that I would rather people waited a bit longer, but were able to play something which I was happier with in terms of a representation for the game, than play something which was pretty rushed and hasn't had as much care and attention to it. So that's where we're at so far. If you're interested in Primus, obviously feel free to give it a wish list and follow along for what we're doing. And when I do release the demo, if you ever have any feedback, please do let me know, in the YouTube comments or something. That would be greatly appreciated. I'm looking forward to getting this game out. I think we are on track to actually be able to get the game out ideally in August. Now, I've said Q3. At the very latest, I want it mid-September, but I think I can get this game out in August. But I think really the most important thing is less about the time that it takes for the game and more about just, if I can get to August, maybe mid-August or something, and genuinely feel happy with the game, then, that's when obviously I'll look to release it. So I'll keep you in the loop with that. But that said, I'll catch you soon.